everyone. Thank you so much. So the title of my talk today is The Fundamental Importance of Pathogen Origination in Public Health Policymaking. So we're brought here today by a shared interest in the COVID-19 pandemic and the ongoing evolution of the COVID-19 disease. In terms of the details of COVID-19 and the pandemic, we are still largely in a process of discovery and investigation when it comes to the disease. So what I mean by this is we're still looking into things like new variants and vaccine administration and rollout strategies and things like that. These are aspects that are unique to this specific disease identity. However, if we look at the overall pattern of infectious diseases in general over the past 10 or so years, we see a notable increase in zoonotic disease activity. And this has been evident through pandemics and epidemics such as influenza, SARS, and MERS. And if you look at the graph here on your screen, you can see that in recent years, there have been shorter spaces between the emergence of new diseases, as opposed to something like when you look at the 60s or just a little bit before, there is just one emergence with larger gaps between the emergences of new diseases. So since COVID-19 does appear to be part of a growing pattern, it's necessary to look into the reasons for this change in pathogen behavior. And one of the main reasons for this increase in zoonotic disease activity is increased human activity. And this includes the consumption and trade of wildlife in market settings. So many of us are familiar with this now famous quote from Bill Gates, which is that we are not ready for the next epidemic or pandemic. So in hindsight, this is very accurate, right? Because we weren't ready. But what's most important about it is that little has actually changed since then. In fact, it's probably more relevant now regarding the next pandemic because of that zoonotic disease activity increase, and it's increasing quite steadily. And there isn't really much reason to assume that this is going to change anytime soon. And so another concern is that we can't really be certain about the specifics regarding the next pandemic. So there's various possibilities in terms of how it might play out in terms of transmission and mortality rate and the type of pathogen that will be involved. If we look at a disease like Ebola and we look at a disease like COVID-19 and we thought about what would happen if we had a pathogen that resulted in a disease that was as deadly as Ebola, but as contagious as COVID-19, we likely would not be ready for such a pandemic. So this quote still is very applicable. However, one thing that we can be fairly confident of if we look back at this graph is that the next pandemic will likely be zoonotic yet again. And so COVID-19 has been addressed from a place of extreme urgency, and the primary objective has been to contain it. This is obviously very important, but it does mean that the disease has not been sufficiently addressed from a causal standpoint. And if we do want to tackle the problem of zoonotic disease more preemptively, then what we need to do is shift our attention from focusing exclusively on disease and symptom behavior and start focusing on the behavior of pathogens. Zoonotic diseases are actually really just manifestations of infections. And this is a characteristic that could actually make them more controllable if they were correctly handled, especially when compared to something like genetic diseases. So my aim is to investigate the causal factors present in the formation of a contagion prior to the onset of illness causation. And for this talk, I'm going to give a brief background on disease causation and then introduce my concept of pathogen origination and show how I feel it can be incorporated into the existing framework of disease etiology. And then I'll briefly conclude by discussing the importance of pathogen origination as a practical implementation in public health policy. So this is a summary of some of the existing work on disease etiology by Broadbent and Smart. As you can see here, disease etiology is split into two main categories. Illness causation, which is an external event that will take place before infection, and it's usually in the form of some kind of an exposure to an infectious agent. And then pathomechanisms, and these are internal bodily responses that will result in symptoms. So in terms of COVID-19, illness causation would be largely related to the proximity to an infected individual. And then we may factor in some other things like air quality and ventilation. And the pathomechanisms would constitute the biological mechanisms that are going to accumulate in the body to result in symptoms, like a fever being one of the most common symptoms. So what's notable about this framework of disease is that it's looking at diseases that are already established. And because they're already established, they probably have some kind of pattern within a population already. And this is reflected in current health policy with the fact that there is an overemphasis on reactionary measures in addressing diseases and pandemics. When we think about COVID specifically, we see how we rely largely on things like masks and hygiene and lockdowns and vaccine implementation. These are things that I call disease management strategies. And they're obviously very important in a situation that's as urgent as this. However, they do leave us vulnerable to certain timeframes. So if we think about this current pandemic, we have had to wait for vaccine rollouts. And we've also had to wait for information to be confirmed and refuted. The problem with this is that it leaves room for error. So at the beginning of this pandemic, the general consensus was that COVID-19 was spread via respiratory droplets and that the wearing of masks was unnecessary for non-healthcare professionals. It was only as information started to grow on the matter and more research was coming out that it was confirmed that COVID-19 was more of an aerosol transmission, and then the wearing of masks became encouraged. And in some places, it was even legislation eventually. So it's not really possible to ascertain how many people may have contracted the disease through this kind of inconsistent communication. So this current framework is very helpful in combating existing disease and in studying disease in existing populations and monitoring the patterns there. However, I believe that there is a fundamental step missing. I think that the formation of the actual contagion needs to be factored into disease etiology. And this is my aim, to investigate the causal factors present in pathogen formation. And I call these factors pathogen origination. This is a causal process that contributes to the emergence of a pathogen responsible for disease prior to the onset of that disease. And acknowledging pathogen origination in public health is an important aspect of public health implementation. It holds a lot of potential for policy. This would involve the identification and control of certain environments that have pathogen origination potential. As I said, this is an ideal method for public health implementation because it amounts to true prevention as opposed to mere disease management. And it has an emphasis on environmental aspects of pathogen and disease formation. So pathogens are not exclusively viral. Viruses are just one of various infectious agents that can result in disease. However, viruses are crucial role players in the formation of pandemics. And viral pathogens are not static either. So they do tend to change and evolve over time. And the origination of a new virus can occur when cells are invaded by different viruses, and then they start to exchange genetic information. This is a process called viral recombination. And viral recombination is a type of pathogen origination. There have been various inquiries into the recombination of various coronaviruses in this case, and some experts have suggested that this virus originated in bats, and it subsequently underwent genetic recombination once exposed to pangolins. And then thereafter, it was able to evolve into a more human-compatible virus. But the fundamental driver of pathogen origination via recombination is the proximity of various species. So proximity allows for interspecies infections, which is something we also call pathogen spillovers. Pathogen spillovers allows for different types of, say, coronaviruses to interact and then recombine. And that's how they are able to form new strains and variants of viruses, helping new viruses to emerge. So as you can hear, there is a strong environmental element to pathogen origination. However, that is not the only aspect. It's not limited to zoonotic enablers or any of those factors, but what it really is an accumulation of causal contributions to the formation of a pathogen that can or will result in a disease like COVID. And since this takes place prior to the disease onset, I've adjusted the existing framework to include pathogen origination as a first step in disease etiology. And an example of a pathogen origination factor in terms of COVID-19 would be the conditions in wet markets. So this is not the only factor involved. There's many other things to consider, like globalization and general hygiene practices. However, I feel that animal consumption is one of, if not the most important consideration origination in a COVID-19 context. So I've included some influential opinions on the matter. When commenting on the worldwide response to the pandemic, Singer and Cavalieri claim that few mention, let alone confront, the underlying cause of the epidemic. Mabellock describes the current pandemic as one of the consequences of a globalized world. Furthermore, when describing the increase in the emergence of zoonotic pathogens, Bengus et al. Point out a rise in global human activity as a causative driver. So what's really notable about all of these observations is that they're each pointing to a different type of pathogen origination in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic. And what this demonstrates for me is the interrelated accumulation of events evolved in the emergence and spread of a pathogen, and how that can result in a disease such as COVID-19. Another important factor in pathogen origination, and something that is worth observing, would be the consumption of African bushmeat. So the CDC defines bushmeat as uncooked or partially treated meat from wild animals. And the general practice of smoking or salting these products is an insufficient means of sterilization to make it more appropriate for human consumption. And it's important to note that the consumption of African bushmeat has already resulted in certain diseases such as Ebola virus. These wild animals often include non-human primates, but what's very important to note is that they often include bats. And bats are a crucial role player in the emergence of disease outbreaks. Bats have been associated with diseases such as rabies, Ebola, SARS, MERS, and COVID-19. So it's very important to be studying coronaviruses specifically in African bats, as many African countries don't actually have regular surveillance programs that look into these viruses in bats. And this is very problematic for coronaviruses specifically because they are said to be very mutatable and they're very compatible with each other in terms of merging to form other coronaviruses. So if we do want to implement a global public health policy that does factor in something like pathogen origination, it may be a valuable starting point to assess the health of bats in something like bushmeat consumption. An ideal form of legislation or implementation would obviously be a ban on wildlife consumption. However, there's various cultural and economic challenges associated with this approach. Current consumers and traders of bushmeat would obviously be greatly disadvantaged since they're relying on bushmeat for income and protein. However, if we're going to draw on the experiences from COVID-19, then we can clearly see that the consumption and trade of wildlife does need to be addressed with growing urgency. So we would have to look into some kind of viable alternative, like an ethical and controlled farming program to supply protein and employment to affected communities as a potential substitute. And this is also applicable to wet market environments in countries like Southeast Asian countries where COVID-19 did originate. So in conclusion, COVID-19 has prompted various responses in terms of pandemic preparedness, and these are largely owing to that current framework of disease etiology that I showed earlier. I noted that this framework is very helpful in disease assessment and studying established disease as well as their management. However, I feel that there is a fundamental step missing, which was pathogen origination. We've had to implement some extreme measures in order to minimize the effects of the illness. However, it's important not to overemphasize these reactionary measures at the expense of the fundamental cause of diseases, which is pathogen behavior and origination. A public health policy that addresses the pathogen of a disease as well as its symptoms has far greater life-saving potential than a public health policy that merely looks at the symptoms and spread of a disease. So if we're coming back to that example of bushmeat in African countries, we note that this practice has already resulted in diseases such as Ebola. And if the trade and consumption of bushmeat is a path for a disease that is as deadly as Ebola, but perhaps as contagious as COVID-19, like I mentioned before, then it would obviously be favorable to be investigating that sort of thing now. And there is still much room for discussion regarding this implementation. In terms of bushmeat, a ban is not completely doable because current consumers may feel that they are entitled to a specific protein source. So the opposition to such a ban may be overwhelming. And we would have to look at some kind of an ethical and controlled substitute. However, whatever the solution is, the emphasis does need to be adjusted to incorporate pathogen behavior in public health policy. The notable increase in zoonotic disease activity is not likely to stop unless pathogens are put in the forefront of public health considerations. Thank you.